Yes, I think now we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. In Stockholm, in Berlin, where we are joining you right now, and in Tbilisi and everywhere in the world, whoever is watching us. So today we are having a conversation with Tor Linstrand. So I will introduce Tor, and then Tor will give us a input presentation, and then we'll have a discussion and also answer some questions from the audience. So Tor is an architect, a senior lecturer in spatial design at Konstfack, at the art school or art university in Stockholm, and one of the founders of LLP Architect Kontor. His practice oscillates between architecture, art, and performance. He works in a diverse array of cultural contexts, often in collaboration with others. His work has been presented at the Venice Architectural Biennale, Tate Liverpool, Storefront for Art and Architecture New York, NAI Rotterdam, Swedish Architecture Museum, and the Shenzhen, Hong Kong BCT Biennale of Urbanism and Architecture. Tor is an award committee member for UNG Svensk Forum, jury member for Young Korean Design Award, and head of the Board of Education at the Architects Sweden. So welcome, Tor, and thank you so much for joining us today. And we're really looking forward to your presentation and discussion with you. So please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tina Tin, for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk at the Biennale. I think these Biennales opportunities for people to meet and discuss architecture, experiment with architecture, and try to understand what architecture is, what you can do in the cities and so on is fantastic, and it's a great opportunity and also exciting to be invited from see this happening from Tbilisi and Georgia. Thank you very much for that. Of course, we are in a strange situation now. Normally you give a talk and you see who you are addressing, and now I sit here in my office in Stockholm on a Saturday afternoon. Streets outside are pretty empty today because of the corona restrictions, and I guess it's the same in many places in Europe and in the world. People listening in the same circumstances. So in a way we are together but very far apart from each other. So I'll do my best to give this lecture. And we said here before you joined us that we would have set off some time for discussions or for questions afterwards that will be relayed through you, Tina Tin, I think, and we will have a little bit of a talk. So I'll try to my very best. It's 1:15. I'll do my best to be as on time as I can with the lecture. So I'm going to talk today a lecture called Society as Playground. I'll try here to share my screen and see if that works. Let me see here.
Yes, great.
Is that working? Yes, great. So it's called Society as Playground, but it is. I think it's a lecture that spans a lot of territory. It will talk a little bit about Swedish architecture tradition. It will talk about a certain point in time where modernism transforms into postmodernisms. It will also touch down on how contemporary cities are being, some dimensions of how contemporary cities are being organized today. But at the center, there will be a discussion about the circumstances or the situation for children in cities historically and today. and about the role of youth culture in shaping the history of the city, and how we can see some of those effects playing out in a city, not only for kids but for all of us today. So it will be kind of meandering thing that goes through a lot of different matters and topics. Let's see. So I thought I'd start here. It's a couple of slides with text and technical information. This is from the Comprehensive Plan for Stockholm. It's the Comprehensive Plan for Stockholm is a legal binding policy documented that is taken every 10 years or so. And it's used as a steering document to see the overall path for the city going into the future. So it's a kind of the leading planning document for the city. And here, this is from the Comprehensive Plan for Stockholm that was adopted by the City Council in 2010. And there is a quote here from the opening chapter. And here what we can see is that according to Stockholm, the most important issue for the comprehensive plan, for how to govern the built environment, is to see that it caters to the need of the business world and the need that the business world have for skilled labor and improved communications. This is done through a priority where you develop Stockholm. You are supposed to develop Stockholm as a good city, whatever that means, with a high quality of life. And this line is important here because it tells us that what we want to achieve is that the workers of the future, so it's not the workers or the citizens that are already here, but the ones who are coming to us in the near future, that they want to live and work here. So the city wants to expand, and the way it wants to expand is by attracting skilled labor from outside of Stockholm. And this is done because in an internationalized world, a people-friendly urban environment is becoming an important part in gaining a competitive advantage towards other cities. And through this, it says in the end, Stockholm can become a more attractive metropolis and become an even stronger brand. So what we see here is city planning, but thought as a kind of something that caters to business, to finance, to money. It's about attracting certain kind of people and not others. It's using planning, good public transport, quality sort of public space as a selling point to attract capital and skilled workforces to Stockholm and prevent them from moving to other cities like, I don't know, Copenhagen or Oslo, Berlin, perhaps, London, Paris, Tbilisi, etc. So you understand the Stockholm here as a corporation, the city as a corporation, fighting other corporations and strengthening their market share. And I find this kind of interesting and quite troubling as well. But we will return to this later. So that's the start. And then if we go here and jump back 60 years or so, we can see Henri Lefebvre, who is a French sociologist and a theorist. Space that was extremely influential in the late 70s or mid 70s. I think it was published in 1974, but a lot of his theories were already known. So it was a compilation of a lifetime of work, you could say. But this is a text that he writes just after the end of the Second World War, and it's a book called The Critique of Everyday Life. And here he talks about that how market, the logics of a market economy, and mass consumption, for instance, or consumption culture is starting to govern the everyday life or the lived experience of people. So already in 47, there was a kind of a growing critique towards the way that sort of market economies or capitalism helped or was directed in order to shape and govern everyday life and the lived experience in the city. Henri Lefebvre was not alone in trying to understand sort of the organization of space through ideas of capitalism and market economy. But we also see this as a kind of how the state is being a collaborator and a facilitator for these kind of shifts. And if we look at two important thinkers on this subject matter, there is, of course, Michel Foucault, that many of you know, but maybe he's most famous for architects because he wrote a book called Discipline and Punish and the Birth of the Prison, where he sort of tries to untangle the way that the modern world or industrialized society is organized in a way where citizens are being disciplined, as he says, through a series of an extended array of institutions and what role space plays in that. So he talks about the clinic and the prison and the school and the factory and the workhouse and the barracks and the family, for instance, as these kind of disciplinary institutional entities. And he uses the panopticon as a design principle. And he talks here about a prison design that was made in the mid 19th century, and where you had maybe most of you know this already, but it's famous. It has a design where you have a guard tower in the middle, an elevated tower, where the guard sits behind the glass windows, and it's dark in the room and it's lit outside. It means that if you look inside, you can't see if there is a guard sitting there or not. It's surrounded by a circle of cells in many levels, and it gives the opportunity, and all the cells are facing towards this guard tower in the middle. And it means that all prisoners can be surveyed by the guard. Only one guard can survey hundreds of prisoners at the same time. So it's a kind of a machine for control. And he uses that as an example or an illustration of how the whole of society is organized then. It builds on this idea that the disciplining powers of the space are based on the panopticon then as a design principle, which in turn is based on the power of visibility and gaze, that through watching you can sort of control a space. And he talks about this as being a society of public institutions where you live your life from preschool and school, library, the civic center, museum, the student housing, the mental asylum. These are all examples that come from that age, and it becomes a way to organize society, but it also becomes a way to organize power and to execute power over others. And he talks here about public space as it becomes this mechanism of control over the individual by referring to the needs of the greater population, which means that as a citizen in the square, I'm being watched by others and I comply through, I want to be seen as being part of this society, so I comply to the rules, and then by that I'm sort of disciplining myself to become this loyal citizen within this system. Anyway, then we have Gilles Deleuze, and he writes a postscript, or kind of a response, you could say, to the societies of control, or the society of discipline, in 1975. And here he sort of expands on Foucault's theories, and he talks about the shift away from physical space, and that the panoptic becomes embedded rather in technological sensors, and these sensors are then spread through society. So this is how he sees the development of the future society. And it's he sees a continuous, interconnected, automated surveillance system that operates on many different scales. It operates both on your personal body, so it becomes something controlled on a very small scale, and a global scale. So it sort of divides these things. So rather than to have these in between, institutions are disappearing in this theory and being replaced by this new correspondence between the body and the globe. And it's using public relations, marketing, and consumer behavior as some of the tools to execute this control. And in the disciplinary society, where one was always starting again, like I go to preschool, then I finish preschool, I start school, and then I finish school, and then I go to work, and these kind of things. In the society of control, he sees a development where you're never really fully finished with anything. So lifelong learning, for instance, finding new skills for new work situations. You never really leave school. You're being productive already or you're being geared towards production from a very young age, for instance. So it's like a breakdown, you could say, of all these traditional institutions. He talks about them as being meta-stable. So they are coexisting in a universal system of deformation. So there is no clear borders anymore between the corporation, the educational system, or the family, for instance. And public space transforms here, according to Deleuze, and becomes something that is not governed by a rule of the majority, but it's rather up for grabs. And it's undergoing the same transformation as the family and the school and the barrack and the factory. It means that it turns into this meta-stable case. So it's like it's it can be a cooperative space and a public space, or it can be understood as being public, but it's in fact private, and so on. This is what Gilles Deleuze foresees in this short text that is quite interesting to read, because it's written approximately 6-7 years before internet becomes widely popular, but it sort of projects this kind of contemporary situation that we live in today. I guess a lot would agree on that. Here is another quote from a book, and I'll make this a bit shorter, but there is an interesting book by Jean Baudrillard, also a theorist and written a lot about space. But he talks in one of his earliest, maybe it's his first book, The System of Objects. He talks about functionality. So he tries to tie in the world of things and describe it as a more like a system of signs. So a more kind of a linguistic approach, you could say, way to understand how objects are to be understood in a world of mass consumption, for instance. He talks that that consumption is not so much a material thing, but it's more like who we are. So it's like we express our identity, or we become our identity through the objects that we surround ourselves with, and the way that we surround ourselves through the logic of how we surround ourselves with things has to do with consumption. And he talks here about, so in the future, in the near future, everyone is an interior architect. So we style and we organize our world around us and manipulate these signs in order to express ourselves. And he talks also about consumption being kind of an opposite, you could say, or a mirror image of production. So consumption works in the way that the more we consume, the more of a desire to consume is created. So it's more like an increasing whole, and we are dragged towards this whole. So it's in the end also devours us, I would say. So these were some of the examples of a critique being formulated towards the way that market economies are being organizing the world and becoming sort of an underlying fabric that dictates the way that we build the world and the objects we create for this world, how we use them, and how it ultimately becomes like the new natural condition of the world, you could say. But this critique was also something that it didn't only happen within the realm of theory, but it was also more or philosophy, if you want. But it was also something that was more put into practice. So this is an image from Paris in 1968, and what we see on the wall, written on the wall, is "Sous le pave, la plage." So underneath the pavement, the beach. And this was a war cry from the situationist movements, and the way they saw an opportunity in the lived experience or in the everyday life, that there was always a revolutionary potential just underneath. So it was like possible to scratch on the surface, and a new reality was waiting to be sort of discovered or actualized in this world. So this was a call to arms, you could say, even though a very poetic call to arms. There was also, of course, books written about this, or I'm thinking here of Jane Jacobs and her 1961 book, The Death and Life of the Great American Cities, which also takes its starting point from seeing qualities in the everyday life and opposing planning and the property developers and architects for destroying the city. Jane Jacobs was an activist, as you all know, and she was greatly concerned with this kind of how things actually worked in a city, what made a city interesting to live in, and so on. And it became and still is an extremely successful critique, you could say, towards modern planning and top-down initiatives when it comes to the city. And then, as an example, there is a book that comes 10 years later by the Robert Goodman, an American planner. He writes After the Planners. It's a harsh critique of planners and architects and the role they play in the development in the city. He sees the architect as a kind of a soft cop, like a soft an example of repression of people's freedoms through planning. But when the police uses, I don't know, his gun or tear gas or whatever, then the planner is using his pen and creating sort of soft spaces for that. So it's these are two examples of a kind of written critique, and there was also a widespread sort of critique towards planning at the time. Here it's an example from New Society. It's Rainer Banham and Paul Barker, Peter Hall, Cyril Price. They write a text called Non-Plan, an Experiment in Freedom. It's also a critique towards planning and ideals of planning, specifically then like modernist planning. And they see like if planning is producing this kind of society, we would be better off with no planning at all. So that's the starting point for this kind of debate article, you could say, or kind of provocation. They propose instead to organize specific zones in Britain, which would be then where there would be no plans, but instead a complete freedom for people to build and how to organize society through this concept of freedom. And this is the illustration of that. So it's clear that here the examples of how this freedom would be would look. It takes its aesthetic starting points in the freeways of the United States, like where they see this kind of more laissez-faire, let-go mentality towards urban planning and so on. And of course, as we all know, these ideas of planning has been sort of taken on by neoliberal governments and in the era of deregulation around the 90s and so on, and became sort of popular again. But I think it's important to note here that I think most of the authors of this article, they I think found themselves on the left side of the political spectrum, but many of the ideas were then adopted and turned into a more neoliberal political argument a couple of decades later. But so some examples of outlining very quickly here this kind of theoretical map of how space and oppression is organized, some of the critique towards modernist planning, which then leads to this kind of idea, where does children and play fit into this? So now we're going to go back quite a lot here, and here we see a famous painting by Peter Bruegel. It's using kind of contemporary, at that time, contemporary Netherlands as a backdrop to tell a biblical story about the census at Bethlehem. And what I find interesting here is that if you look in the background in this that shows like everyday life, you can see here sort of people going about their business, but you also see kids building a snowman, throwing snowballs at each other, kids skating, and so there is this play has always been around and been part of the kind of the part of every city or every environment that kids are in naturally, but there is very little evidence that it was organized until much later. So there is a history of how you organize the way kids play. So if this is the starting point, then we can move forward here. This is a text by Friedrich. It's an example. A pedagogue, a German pedagogue that developed ideas about pedagogy for kids in the late 18th century. So he's most famous because he was the one that came up with and laid out the principles of the kindergarten. Kindergarten was a movement that existed starting in Germany, but then spread all through Europe and became very prominent also in the US. And the concept of the kindergarten was to organize the life of children in a kind of a pedagogical way. So Friedrich Fröbel was critical towards the capacity of the nuclear family to take proper care of the growth of kids in terms of their mental and societal growth, if you want. So one idea was this kindergarten. It was like that, like seen as a garden for kids. So you plant kids in the garden and you watch them grow. It also contained what we see here. It was a series of what Friedrich Fröbel called gifts. And there were small boxes with toys inside. And they would help. So you started with gift number 1, and they became increasingly more difficult. And they where the kids through play could learn things about physics, geometry, math, construction, and so on, and colors and so on. So these are some examples of how things are being put together. And they are from the early, I think this is from the early 19th century, this kit. So corks and small steel wires that could be connected into different patterns. Here we see an example from a Swedish preschool in the much later, like in the 50s. But this takes its this is called where you gather every day. So kids today still do this, that before lunch you gather, you sit down in a circle with the teacher and around you, and then you sing a song or you talk to each other, and it has to be, there's an organization to this in the terms of like you take turns talking, you listen to others when they speak, you acknowledge and you see each other. And this circle, this gathering, it was an invention also of Friedrich Fröbel and part of every day in the kindergarten. And it was the idea was to sort of train kids into becoming sort of civil citizens, you could say, and so it's a kind of a training for how public space would work, you could say. You put forward your argument, you listen to others, and you acknowledge that you are there together as a collective. These sort of why I am talking so much about this Friedrich Fröbel is that he was instrumental in sort of organizing ideas of even of contemporary pedagogy, and his legacy is extremely important to understand how we see pedagogy in relationship to kids today, and that it's not only about sort of learning that we do in school, theoretical learning, but it had like all these practical sides of how we are together in school, for instance, or what we play with, and the toy as a way to organize kids to learn certain things, the pedagogical tools, toy. And why it's specifically interesting for architects is that kindergarten, it was not like a preschool that is there in order to make it possible for parents to go to work, but kindergarten was a very exclusive activity, and it was used mostly by the privileged classes in society, or exclusively by the privileged classes, I would say. So, in the privileged classes, it was very common to send your kids to kindergarten. So, for instance, we see here is examples of Charles and Ray Eames, and they're building the American designers and architects, mostly designers maybe. They built the outside of their office. They built something called the Cardboard City, and this was sort of moving boxes that they got when they got shipments of the furniture they designed, and they were left over, and they sort of came up with this idea that it can be turned into these houses, and they created this little city that was there for the employees and friends, kids, and so on to come and play outside the office. So there's this Cardboard City, and Charles and Ray Eames, they had both attended kindergartens when they were young, so it was clear that some of the impressions that they learned from kindergarten, the pedagogies there, sort of translated into their later activities as designers. And here you can clearly see that influence. For instance, if you compare to these gifts that Friedrich Goebel I showed you in the earlier time here, this is a product that it's still for sale, I think, through the you can find it on their webpage, I think, but it's called The Toy. And the toy, it's like sticks and colored vinyl fabrics that attach. And with them, there's a kind of, you can build a series of kind of shapes and forms, and together they can be constructed into all sorts of different, like a little house, or as in this case, an airplane and so on. But this idea that play, architecture, design, and pedagogy here, it comes together in one. And here is another version of that. This is the Little Toy, and the Little Toy is kind of a model version of the toy. So it's like the toy, a toy of a toy, if you want. So it has the same kind of elements, but here you build it as a kind of a small house or a playhouse, or like a set of meccano, you could say. Another example, and this is from later. This is from Cartel. They worked with a design office called Centro Kappa, and they created something they called the Cartel school system in 1978. And it was oh no, I thought I had an image of that. But it's a system where children get like a modular box, and they build their own furniture. So it's a way where you, as a kid, you have a little special tools, and you could build your own learning environment, you could say. So this was for the school. So you can build together it in an infinite number of ways. So it's pretty similar in many ways to the Charles and Ray Eames proposal here, but a bit more kind of sturdy and functional and so on. But it also tells a story about an idea where kind of these barriers between architecture, design, play sort of intersects, you could say. Another example from that time, because this is where kind of architects start to take a specific interest in the role of children in the city and what they play with. This is Aldo Van Ike. He was an architect that did a lot of work in Amsterdam in the 50s and the 60s. His idea was to, after the Second World War, there was a lot of kind of empty plots in Amsterdam, sort of vacant, abandoned, perhaps houses that had been destroyed during the war. So he sort of located all these for an opportunity to do something else. And what he proposed was to build playgrounds in them. So he created these designs, and you see this kind of, it was very steel a kind of a steel tubular system of very simple forms, like a square and half circle and a rectangle and so on, and often like hard surfaces combined with like a sandpit, for instance. So there was this kind of idea to use these vacant lots and make them into an opportunity for kids to play instead of it being just unused. And they became extremely popular. And I think in the end, Aldo Van Ike built something like almost 1,000 playgrounds that he designed in Amsterdam in these years. So but it meant also that the children's place in the city got a formalized version, you could say. Here is another view on examples. You see there's the same kind of materials and forms coming together, being combined. And Aldo Van Ike talks about this, that they are deliberately abstract forms, because the idea is that the imagination of the kids is what makes it into. So like if you see a tubular half circle cylinder, half covered, then it can become a house, it can become a spaceship, it can become anything that the children imagine. So there was a deliberate idea of this sense of kind of abstract geometries that sort of combined, I guess, modernist ideals with the idea of the imagination of the child. Here is another example of that. And there was, like, in this time, I think that there is what you can sense among artists, architects and so on, there was quite many that took a very particular interest in the situation for kids and the role of kids in the streets and in the cities. This is Nigel Henderson. He was part of the independent group, a collective of artists and filmmakers and sculptors and architects. The architects were Alison and Peter Smithson. Also the architectural theoretician Rainer Banham was part of the independent group, Richard Hamilton and so forth. And Nigel Henderson, he was a photographer, and he specialized on kind of a way of photography that he called as found, that you just take pictures of whatever is in front of you in a way. And he took a long series of photos of kids playing, like finding these moments of spontaneous play in the city, sort of half in between organized and free play. And I think this kind of idea of kids playing and how you can imagine new worlds and build your own worlds, you can also see this on a different scale, and that is connected to the whole autonomous cultural scene in, for instance, here it's an example from the US. These were like a commune. It's called Drop City because the inhabitants call themselves, there was both that they were dropouts of school, but also they had this idea of drop paintings that they did in art school, where they threw paint from the roof of the school and it hit the floor and sort of created this kind of spontaneous patterns. So this kind of Drop City was a commune in Colorado, in the a very desolated site in Colorado that built up in the 60s, and it became one of the most photographed and popular communes, or popularized, I would say, mediatized communes in the history of the US. What you can see here is these domes. They are built out of roofs of cars, so they had an understanding with different, or I don't know, semi-understanding at least, with where they were allowed to saw off the roof of cars and turn them into these kind of pentagon shapes, and they were combined then. So it's like a Buckminster Fuller design built out of used car tops in a way. And this kind of freedom or self-organize, how to self-organize that we saw in the kind of the independent cultural scene in the US and in Europe as well. It's also something that you could clearly see when it came to the trends in play, how play was being planned and organized in the city. And this is a book by someone that in Britain has been called the grandmother of playgrounds, Lady Ellen of Hurtwood, Marjorie Hurtwood. She was a landscape architect, but she was also an advocate for adventure playgrounds. And adventure playgrounds was something that became popular all over Europe, specifically in Britain through Marjorie Hurtwood, but also in Denmark and I know in Germany, in Berlin, and there were all through Germany, I think, and also in Sweden, for instance, but in other places as well. In New York, you could find them also. And what they had as a starting point, they were like, this is one of the first chapters of the book by Marjorie Hurtwood, and it's a playground. And where she criticized playgrounds for being sort of, who would want to play in these horrible spaces, and instead she was sort of proposing these adventure playgrounds. And an adventure playground, it was just an area where kids were given material that they themselves could use to build with. So it was like a scrapyard, you could say, where bricks and wood, leftover wood, and then the organizers, they provided the kids with tools, and the idea was that they would work they had the responsibility for their own actions and work, and also for other kids around them. And that they should themselves build and organize their playgrounds. So rather than adults designing playgrounds for them, the kids would be actively involved in making them themselves. And this was a very radical proposal, because it was not only an idea of how children play, but it had an underlying idea as well, in order to sort of teach kids to become more active citizens. That the idea here is that through the adventure playground, with responsibilities and the feeling that I can do this myself, and a certain amount of danger, kids would also be able to, as adults, take responsibility for their environments. So there was this came from planners with the idea that kids in the future would be active citizens informing their own environments. So here we can see kids being, this is from different examples from Britain mostly. Think of these kind of self-organized playgrounds. And as you can see, they were, kids had the opportunity to make big fires, and potentially it was quite dangerous, but exhilarating as well. And Marjorie Hurtwood said, for instance, that it's easier to mend a broken bone than a broken spirit. So this was the idea, that danger was also something that was essential to the growth and of kids full individuals in a way. So there was also always a sense of danger connected to these places. And this is so I like this image a lot. This is from an adventure playground in Hackney in London. And it's the in the middle of the book. There is a whole spread with this image. And it has a caption that says, "The end of a perfect day." So Marjorie Allen or Marjorie Herthwood here have this idea that children organizing their own everyday life, building their own environments, being responsible for their own environments and being responsible for how they interact with other kids around them was kind of the essence of how playgrounds and play should be incorporated in the city. And this is an example from Stockholm, where you see a kind of a combination of different things. Arvid Bengtsson, he was also kind of an advocate for adventure playgrounds, but he was also the city gardener of Gothenburg and responsible for a lot of design playgrounds. And here we can see a combination of Aldo Van Ike's kind of steel structures, you could say, combined with natural materials and some huts. And not shown in this image was that there was also a big part that was like a scrapyard. So this is a kind of a combination between an old school playground and a more adventure playground in Sweden. So this was something that sort of impacted generations of kids for a long period of time in parts of Europe, at least, and the US. This is an example from a similar activity that was a project I did a couple of years ago with kids in my neighborhood, where we sort of built a tree house together. It was like an experiment for me. So I just went out in the woods with my son, and we had some rope and a saw. And then we did this as an experiment. And it was interesting because they immediately, when we started, there were like so many kids coming along. So I ended up kind of trying to look after 12 kids and building this tree house in the middle of the forest. And so there's this kind of, it was surprising to me how little you see this being done, I would say, and how engaging it also is for kids, you know. And I think it was also an experiment in this feeling of responsibility and security, because kids, 5-year-olds, be quite high up and using tools and so on. It's something. It's quite stressful, and I was always surprised to see how little other parents sort of easily gave over responsibility to me, or didn't survey their kids at all. So this was kind of for me just an idea of experimenting with these ideas of the adventure playground myself. And here this is an example of an architect, Palle Nielsen and Gunilla Lundahl, together they made a proposal for Modellen. It was designed, the space was designed by Palle Nielsen. He was a young Danish architect at the time, living in Stockholm. He was part of a kind of a protest movement, an environmental protest movement that was heavily engaged in debate and actions in the city of Stockholm. For the and at the Modern Museum, they made this exhibition called a model. Let's see if I have another image. So basically, the model was an idea to build an enormous indoor playground for kids. So they built this kind of maze environment of ropes and leftover wood. There was paint in the corner. And it gave kids an opportunity to visit the museum and engage with it in different levels, and just play around like this there was a foam, like a pool of leftover foam where kids could jump. And you can see here in the down right corner, it's like worried parents looking on as the kids are like going bananas in the museum. And this was an interesting exhibit because it turned like the concepts of the playground being inserted into the like the modern museum, a contemporary art museum. It became this kind of border between a performance and an action happening. But it also turned like parts of real life being suddenly exhibited as a work of art, you could say. So this was showed some of the modes of experimentation of how kids and kids culture is being introduced and also transformed into kind of a more into the discourse of art and architecture, you could say. Here are more examples of kids given free rein in sort of organizing and making their own spaces. And this is another, it's also from the same, there was another exhibition in one of the connecting halls in the Modern Museum as an exhibition by the sculptor Eva Appeli, who made these kind of dolls sitting at a table. And one of the participants from the model show has sort of removed all his clothes, covered in paint, and he goes and like discovers the museum. And I think it sort of, this was published in the daily paper and in 1971. And it shows this kind of, I would say, really radical shift of how you can, and a radical shift towards how you perceive an audience within an art museum in a way. And I think this was also heavily informed by these kind of theories of playgrounds, and as we saw in the earlier examples. And this is an image of how there's some of these, the organization that Palle Nielsen, who made the model, was part of. It was called Alternative City. Here they, a few years earlier, before the show in the Modern Museum, they organized a series of events disrupting the way that mass consumption is governing the city. So this is called Stop the Christmas Terror, it says in Swedish. So it's not the Christmas of capital, it's yours. So it was a way of promoting an alternative Christmas in 1968. And I show it because I would say that it illustrates a way where there was a movement that sort of questioned the order of how the city was being organized and through the logics of market economy, and how that was informed with by an expression of autonomy, that you could see the autonomy to shape your own world is being reflected in the radical pedagogical approaches of children being able to sort of affect their own worlds. This same group also had this view on a separate project which was called Action Conversation, and they meant that you never hear from children in topics about this development of the city. They are sort of an unheard, like voices unheard. So this was a project that created an opportunity for kids to be heard in a way. So they organized a series of conversation where they allowed children to talk about how they experienced life in the city and their expectations of the future, and they just transcribed these conversations and published them. So there was this archive of voices of children in respect of the city. This is another protest, and finally, there in Sweden, the most famous protest of the movement Alternative City was called the Fight of the Elms, and there's a series of elm trees in a central square in Stockholm, and they were supposed to be taken down to make place for a new subway entrance, and people chained themselves to these trees, and there was a long protest that ended with the politicians backing down and changing the entrance to the subway station, and it was the biggest victory of the alternative city at the time, but it also established them as a power, giving them a voice in how the city was being sort of planned and organized from there on. And we can see in parallel in Copenhagen, these are protesters that are sort of breaking into a former army barracks or army area for the military in Copenhagen that had been abandoned for a few years. They break in and they claimed it as an autonomous zone of Christiania, and it still is one of these autonomous communes in Europe. So if you visit Christiania, there are other rules that apply, for instance, and has been since 1971. So there was this, trying to use this as examples of this demanding autonomy from autonomy to shape the city in the way that you would like a more direct democracy idea towards the city, rather than the top-down planned idea. It came through the kind of the hippie commune and the anti-establishment trends that was sort of influenced architects and artists at the time, but it also came through this idea of the playground as being the playground is ultimately being a form of system of oppression, and that the adventure playground was a way to organize the city, or like a model to organize the city in a different way. And another interesting book on this subject is called The Child in the City. It's written by Colin Ward, and it was published in 1978. And Colin Ward, he was a landscape architect, a leader of the anarchist party in the UK. So this book is heavily influenced by the political ideas of anarchy, but specifically from the view of the child in the city. So this is how the city is, the book is being organized. So it's a bit about how children live in the city today, how they use the city, so observations of how they use the city, and then there is a kind of an proposal of how the city could be organized in a different way. And the book was it has these chapters, but it also has a lot of images that show children playing in cities all over the world. So there was like a photo essay. There was several photographers sent out to document how kids sort of occupy the city, and then the texts are written in relationship to these findings in a way. So it's quite an interesting book. And here is some of the quotes from that book. So he talks about playgrounds as child ghettos, and that they sharpen the division between the worlds of adults and children. One should be able to play everywhere, easily, loosely, and not be forced into a playground or park. The failure of an urban environment can be measured in direct proportion to the number of playgrounds. Down with playgrounds, free the children. So what he see here is that playgrounds are not a solution for kids in the city. It's just illustrates how badly adapted to how badly adapted cities are to the needs of children. So playgrounds, you could say, like the more playgrounds you have, that's evidence of how badly the city functions for the needs of kids. So he would say rather that if you start with the kids, then this whole city becomes a playground. And this is interesting because I think it's some kind of something I will talk about now in the last bit here. I'm gonna try to tie this together now towards the end. So this are typical images from this book. So it's similar, I think, to some of the adventure playground, that children have like this built-in thing where the city is both exciting and dangerous, and that kids explore the city with their whole bodies and not only with their minds and eyes, but it's something tactile world that they operates within, and that they are and we as adults, they always find, oh, that's an inappropriate behavior, don't do that, that's dangerous, and so on. We are sort of always trying to sort of persuade them not to follow their own instincts. And he's like, what if the world was built rather with this as an, not, how would the city look if that the way that children explores the world would be a starting point for the design and not something that would be seen as problematic. So these are examples of how kids do it. So you can to find little spaces, sit together and create your own little mini worlds, often at edges along a line, or like it's these small spaces that children take command over. It can be found all over the world, a similar pattern of how kids use spaces, and it also seems to be working over time. So like 40 years later, kids are, if you observe them, they're doing the same thing. They found the same spaces. I'm going to push forward here to end up. Let's see how we are with time. Yes, so these are examples of how kids use the city, and then there has been also documentations of how cities are being used by kids as a way of critique. So this is a new modernist neighborhood in Stockholm being built in the late 70s, where specifically the harsh, you could say, unfinished modernist landscapes were used as a kind of a critique. So here it's this book was a very influential book in the end of the 70s, criticizing the new neighborhoods built through modernist design principles in the outskirts of Stockholm. So we see here kind of things burning, kids playing on like empty car lots or in parking garages, and these were taken as evidence of an environment that absolutely don't work. So this could be images coming from the book by Colin Ward that shows the capacity for imagination and the play that is dormant in all children and activated all the time, as an opportunity of taking command over your own situation and claim space, though. But here in this case, it's seen as used as a way to critique the failures of modernist design. And this gave became also something that, so kids grow, like older kids growing up during this time, they also sort of claimed spaces. So this is an occupation done by the punk movement in the suburbs of Sweden in 1979. So they 19 or 17, and they created they occupied a youth center, and they named it the Oasis. And at the Oasis, you were free to sort of play music and come and join them and so on. So it's run and organized, even though illegally, but it was run and organized by the kids themselves. And this was a support concert being given. And it says in the background there, demand an oasis in every suburb. So it was like an idea of this movement to spread, not to be just a one-off example, but something where it happened all over the city. This is another punk band sort of doing these kind of spontaneous outdoor concerts. This one is in another suburb in Stockholm at the same year. This is another band, and as you can see, the participants here are very young. So this is the singer is called Tom Jansson. He is a singer in a punk band called Trams, which is Swedish for rubbish, and it's also from the same event there, Demand an Oasis in every suburb. And Tom, who is the singer, he is also one of the main organizers of the occupation of the youth center, and he is 12 years old at this time. So this idea of autonomy, that it was something sort of that ran through society, and it was expressed in this kind of radical pedagogical ideas of the adventure playgrounds of artists and architects, but it was also something that was expressed by children themselves in these examples like this occupation of a youth center. And at the time, this is for similar, same time, it's a film called Warriors, and it plays out in the US, in New York City, in a kind of a near future scenario. And it follows a group of a gang called the Warriors, and they are trying to kind of go back to Coney Island through the night of New York, and they face other youth gangs, and they fight in the city, and eventually they reach the target. But it sort of portrays the city as being taken over by youths, young gangs that are living kind of in a life of anarchy, with no rules, with no adults roaming the streets and destroying it. So it became this kind of idea of the same with the punks, of young people as being kind of out of control, and their society needed to protect themselves from. And that is also what happened in a way, because in 79, then Thatcher is being elected as prime minister, and at the same time we have Ronald Reagan as president in the US, and we have a massive conservative right-wing wave that sweeps all over the Western world. And Margaret Thatcher, she goes to election with her famous, but that time famous slogan, "There is no alternative." So there is no alternative to market economy. Like socialism doesn't work, and it results in this kind of youth gangs taking over the city. And there is so modernist ideas of planning and this kind of radical pedagogy sort of disappears. Architects starts to become interested in postmodernism instead, opening up. So this is a public space, and it becomes turns into something different. And in order for us to find time to question now, I'm going to jump forward here a bit, because otherwise we won't make it. But we can start. Maybe we'll start here. Here we go. And so so we have these on the building up of autonomy of pedagogy, of kids taking over the city. We have kind of the response, the political response to that in '79. That sort of opens up for a neoliberal shift. But we also have, in parallel, a kind of a development of the market economy into certain spaces that we can see as a kind of an embryo or a kind of the starting point for the idea of the playground as an idea of how to organize the city. And I'm thinking here of the shopping mall. So this is a shopping mall from 1956 in the US. And I have to see, wait, just, yeah, yes, sorry. So, and it was designed by the Austrian architect Victor Gruen. Victor Gruen fled to the US in the Second World War, and his mission that he spoke about was that he wanted to bring Vienna to the United States of America. And the way he did it was that the intensity of the Viennese city of Vienna, was being, how can that be packaged and turned into like a shopping mall? And this is the first sort of indoor shopping mall. And it had this a concept that Victor Gruen developed, is something called the Gruen effect. And the idea there was that the environment should be so immersive that you lose yourself. So it's a bit like building a labyrinth, but at the same time also so it's a kind of a balance between being disoriented and able to orient yourself at the same time. It's constantly something that interests you and that drags you along and keeps you excited and curious and leads you further and further into this kind of labyrinth of shopping. And this is called the Gruen effect, and it has been the governing principles of shopping malls ever since. So we can see this idea also being explored by the radical architect group Archizoom and Andrea Branzi in the No Stop City project of '67, which is 10 years later. This idea of the future city being a kind of a blend between an office space and a shopping mall, endlessly stretching out over having no outside borders really, but in a continuous landscape of interiors. And here citizens are only occupied. We are not really working or going through this. We live in this kind of continuous state where we are just organizing materials and interiors around ourselves. So if we remember, this is from the same time as this book, The System of Objects, that I spoke about in the beginning by Jean Baudrillard. But here it's translated, you could say, almost into like an architectural project. So this is both like a fantasy for where the city is heading, like a projection for a future of the city. But it's of course also understood as a critique. Like, is this? This is the life we're heading towards, but is it the life that we want somehow? It's this kind of freedom, but freedom within an extremely oppressive system, you could say. This was done in a series of, projects or models and also furniture. And it was also something that was explored by someone like Ettore Sottsass, but on the scope of the whole planet, like we have to reinvent humans, and the only thing we do is kind of to populate or to spread through the world series of experiences that we can use as almost like future temples of humanity. So we are no longer engaged in production of work. We are only, all that is solved through an automated system that gives us all the sort of material. It caters for all our material needs. This is similar to the Out-Soon proposal, and what we are doing is kind of to organize our leisure time in any way we want, and it's seen as a series of kind of the world as a festival or the world as a playground with different architectural devices. Like here it's an observatorium for looking at the night sky, and dispensers of cha-cha and rock and roll, I think it's called, the one to the right. So a series of these kind of global stations of something in between a temple and a playground and a leisure zone. But what happened with architecture instead of going in this direction was that it became pavilions, but of a very different kind. So there's this kind of the neoliberal agenda in politics needed a new aesthetics, and the new aesthetics was found in a kind of a return to classical ideals and play with that. So there was this kind of maybe the more queer anti-establishment postmodernism that was displayed by Charles Moore and those people, or the intellectual anti-authoritarian kind of postmodernism proposed by Rem Koolhaas. But there were also this kind of very kind of conservative historicism, postmodernism that's what advocated by property developers like Robert Davis, for instance, and also Len Krier. This is this project, Poundbury, that Prince Charles was an advocate for instance, or the Celebration City by the American, I think the general plan, or the plan was made by Robert A.M. Stern, who was like an American architect. In a Celebration City, that was a piece of land in Florida owned by Disney, and you could move in to these kind of single-family houses, and they come in a variation of different styles. So they all built on the same modular form, you could say, but you can change and customize details and choose from an range of different customizable kind of add-ons that gives each house an individual expression. And there is a series of styles, Victorian, Neo, Tudor, and so on. So and this was part of the new urbanist concepts, and something that we can see here being sort of appropriated in contemporary times. This is the Beauvoir schoolhouse. This it's built at this post office from Florida. This here from Seaside as a starting point for a little playhouse that was auctioned out to get money for a private school. Or we can see it in kind of playhouses that you can buy online. So this is the Alice Tudor style cubby house from Hip Kids, and this is another Grand Victorian cubby house from Lilliput Playhomes. And here, and these are then shown in these commercials with how children are sort of playing adults, or I don't know. It's like becomes almost like a Handmaid's Tale nightmare story. Anyway, so the shopping mall postmodernist style is sort of both using this play as a starting point to, but more in terms of like role play or getting excited and so on. But it's this ideas of commercialism governs and controls the city, And it's ended up in some of the examples of how contemporary cities are being built now as a series of public spaces as intense, playful, you could say, experiences. This is Olafur Eliasson's extension to the Aarhus Danish city's contemporary art museum on the top. It's built in 2011, but today it works like one of the prime Instagram sites of the world. It's a rainbow. Let's say it's colored glass sheets that you walk around, and it sort of shifts your view of the city through these kind of colored filters. Or we can see the High Line as one of these kind of experience public spaces built on experiences. Here you walk along this kind of old train track and you sort of consume the city as you scroll along. It's an example of one of the most successful, economical successful intervention projects in the way that it has driven up property values along the High Line to astronomical sums. And we have a pedestrian public plaza running through a poor neighborhood in Copenhagen, tying it together. So it's using these kind of something in between a playground and a park as a way to sort of make also Copenhagen become a more interesting and exciting city for capital to invest in. We have the example from Bryant Park, which is a park that is owned by the property owners who surrounds the park. In the back, we see the City Library of New York, but it's also private property developers, and they jointly own the Bryant Park through something called Bryant Park Corporation. So it's a kind of a park, but it's privately owned. They measure the activities and they program the activities in order to make it into the most successful park in New York. So and it also has, because it has become such a popular destination, that has also connected to impacted the property values of the surrounding partners in a very positive way. So here we see sort of corporate public interests are being mingled together, and it often has this kind of ideas of activities that is designated for in different ways playful, rather than being about organizing, yourself autonomously, you would say. And the shed is also such a playful, enormously big space by also Dillon Scofidio and Renfro. So it's the same architects that made the High Line. So they are repeating this at Hudson Park, which is an extremely expensive, massive new neighborhood in New York that connects the mid-Manhattan with the Hudson River front. And here is another example also from that place, which is called the Vessel. So we see here constructions like really popular, deemed successful and spectacular new public spaces that are sort of operated through a combination of, I would say, playgrounds, but for adults, corporations, an extension of corporate concepts onto the city. And as in the case of the Vessel and the Bryant Park, the public spaces themselves are corporate entities. In the Vessel, you have to, it's free, but you have to have a ticket. So you get a ticket, but you don't pay for it, but you still get an admission through a ticket. And when you accept that ticket, you also subscribe to the rules of the Vessel and the corporation, which means that it owns all the images that you take there. the image of you at the vessel is free for the corporation to use for in any way they want. So it becomes this kind of information gatherer, you could say. So we are kind of finally here sort of drawn into this kind of space of where former borders between analog and digital rights are being connected, where distinctions between playground, public space, oppressive and repressive systems are being sort of continuously more and more entangled somehow. And the only way I see like there is a way out of this perhaps is that we also know that through history there has been these old plans, and we all live these results of these old plans, but they can often come with a surprise, because everyday life, even though there are a lot of repressive systems, it always reaches out the hand to point to that another future is possible. Something like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very, very interesting. I have so many things to say, but I think I have to wait a bit. Maybe Tobias has one comment, and then...
Well, I have tons of comments, to be honest. So first of all, my biggest sympathy for having over 100 slides for a lecture of 45 minutes. That's something that I completely understand, and I was totally prepared to listen for at least 1 hour longer. I tried to summarize it very quick, even though I would love to go into a lot of details. But as far as I understood you, what you tried to do, or what you introduced a little bit, was what also was represented in that quote of Jenny Holtz in the end, that kind of now we do live this accidental outcomes of the plannings of starting in the 40s and 50s, and you made it quite clear in that historical review that there were good intentions in it. Then there was like this first little shift that you introduced, which was I think a pretty clever one, by connecting punk and hardcore to like maybe as an outcome of being over in an over pedagogy, going further. And then the interesting point was where you turned via the shopping mall into postmodernism, and kind of made. I think I was really a little bit scared at that point, because in the historical part, I felt like, okay, I discovered a lot during my childhood, the adventure playground and so on and so on. And by the shift with the shopping mall, it was like as if this was completely prepared out of it and used to what you described as a virus, the consumerism, and to use it against then grown-ups who experienced this as kids and youngsters in a way. So to cut myself short in a way, there's again the elephant in the room of politics and repoliticizing citizens towards their perception of public space, but also to the overall connection of society, consume, corporatism, and any kinds of politics in a way. So probably you can like say here what we kind of cut you short with the lecture. Sorry, that's overwhelming.
Well, I think that what I want to show is that often history has two different sides, and they are interpreted in different ways. I think that this movement for autonomy that is expressed in the hippie communes of the late 60s, the situationists' sort of anti-establishment critique in also the late 60s, and sort of maybe culminating in the punk movement of the late 70s. That's a very it's like a short period of time, but it's a period of time of ideas that radical transformation of society is possible. There is a strong belief in that through practice, through theory, through all these things. And what happened was that a lot of that energy became, at that point, I think establishment was modernist or kind of modern social democracy in the West. Both in the US, or building sort of stable institutions, making the better, sort of organizing society through modernist ideas of the welfare state, which aim was equality, I think, and justice in a certain way. But for some reason, this was not enough. You know, it's like social democracy was always linked to market economy as a tool. You know, it was an alliance, an unholy alliance between different forces in a way. And I think so a lot of the critique that came towards the establishment came from the left. But rather than to make a leftist progressive turn where social democracy was forced to become more progressive and more radical, you know, in terms of environmental issues, in terms of direct democracy, in terms of giving freedoms to different groups to act in a different way, to live out, like this idea of that became realized, but through a neoliberal political frame, I would say. So the freedom was not being expressed as a kind of an extension of socialist or left-wing thought, but it was instead taken over and weaponized by a new conservative push that we see. And I can see that there are similarities very much today. We have these kind of, again, concepts of kind of radical representation of suppressed minority groups, for instance, within the city, activism of direct democracy, of being more autonomous and free in a way. Like that whole activist side is happening, you know, once again. And at the same time, we have all this kind of extremely much more, I would say, reactionary conservatism than we had with Reagan and Thatcher. I mean, in retrospect, they seem pretty harmless if you compare to some of the more populist right-wing figures that we see on the world stage today, right? So to me, it's kind of interesting to, I don't know, like because it feels like we are reliving in certain aspects, like the late 60s and the 70s again, but the stakes seem to be even higher now, if that makes sense. I'm thinking of climate change on the one side as something we need to sort of address, and then on the other side, like the threat of, well, borderline fascism or authoritarian rule, for sure, with sort of religious, also with religious tendencies as well.
Thank you.
I don't know if it was an answer to your question. I'm making it more complicated, but to me, it's like it's interesting to see this kind of.
Thank you. I will go back a bit to the playground and children and the city. I guess, like as you also mentioned, you have children, right? That you went to build the treehouse in the woods. I guess, like when we start having children, we have the different perception of the city as well. Well, this was in my case like that we kind of perceive the city and see the city in another way. also like child friendly or not, like, and I also had many times struggles with the playgrounds, that they are like too safe also. Everything is like with safety measures. Sometimes I try to let my children play like outside of the playground, so they kind of develop more fantasies. No, how should I play? It's not like, okay, this is a swing, this is a slide, so they can invent their own toys somehow, no? Because in this world of playgrounds, it's also very structured and very planned, like also life of the kids, what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And also, like, I think very often about my own childhood in Georgia, where I've never ever seen a playground in my life, like this kind of planned playgrounds as we have right now. Basically, like, my childhood was, it was like time of war. We had most of the times like no electricity. So we spent like entire childhood in the street. There were also times where we didn't have school because of the war. So we spent the child in our own yard, like patio, like in front of our blocks, where we had, this was our playground, but there were like only trees. There was a bit of nature, no, but I'm trying to also reflect on that. How did this influence me, and what did it become right now in Georgia, for example, that nowadays fewer people let their kids go to play outside in front of their houses. And we have also the same kind of copy-paste playground installed in one neighborhood to another, without any sense of why are they there, why children need this kind of playground. And I also like try to reflect what has happened with our own experience, for example, in my generation, how we spent our own childhood, and why did it so abruptly become like this, what we have now. Because I find it like when I go back, I find it's, sometimes I ask some of my friends, did you let your kids play outside? No, I don't let them. I take them somewhere specifically. So yeah, it's maybe just, it's not a question, it's just a reflection to also kind of connect this with the locality of Georgia in specific. So I don't know, like, what is your childhood experience, Toby, that you grew up in Germany? You didn't have this kind of childhood as I had, for example. No, it was quite different.
Yeah. As I said, I mean, a lot of the models that come from social democratic planning of playgrounds, I experienced them myself. But I mean, the question is a little bit, as I think you already also said, Tor, this is also part of history in a way. I mean, it is super difficult, I guess, to compare Sweden, Germany, and Georgia at a certain point. But then I also have to say that I also experienced playing on the streets, and I think this was probably 95% of the time playing. So you had something and drew a goal onto a wall, and then it was a football ground and like very easy things. And then the adventure playground was something that you probably go to on Sunday with mom or dad or the grandparents in a way. And the interesting thing is, like, where the Biennale asks the question, what do we have in common, is that a lot of the things that I was saying before that frightened me in your lecture are kind of the common thing now. So the privatization of public space. I think this is like the same it's done with the same model in Tbilisi as it is done in Stockholm, as it is done in Germany. And even though the starting points might be different in the beginning, it gets leveled out. But it's probably something that we don't want to have in common in a way. I mean, we want to have it in common as good public space and as a space where children could play and live, and where also we could play and live in a way as adults. So probably to form a question out of that, I mean, we as people, like being in the fields of planning, like town planning, urban planning, architecture, and also teaching at art schools and universities, and thereby theorizing things. I try to ask a very naive question now, but you said we kind of repeat a little bit what happened in the 60s and 70s, maybe some, forgive me for saying it like that, but flourish ideas of public space that we all know, where at the same time these aesthetics are faster commodified than they are developed by certain initiatives. And then on the other hand, also we experience something that probably doesn't work like punk worked, but for example, here during the pandemics, there's the phenomenon that there are youth gangs strolling through the streets from like small groups, 5, but also to big groups up to 30, 40 people, aged between 14 and 20 maybe, that all of a sudden in this harsh pandemic situation don't have a space no more. So I think this moment of critique returns. But what I'm trying to ask you, and it is really an unfair question somehow, because I think it's not so easy to answer it, but where do you see like the golden line on the horizon, or the light at the end of a tunnel, where we could probably slip in and turn it on the back? The whole thing. I know it's not a nice question to ask.
Yeah. No, but I think that there is. I mean, what we know, like if we start with the kids, it's like kids, they play all the time, and they play with whatever is in front of them. So we can build playgrounds, but kids will not just play in playgrounds. That's like an adult idea of organizing, time and space. We schedule, now we are there. Like we have in Sweden a phenomena because of the weather, I guess, like a lot of parents now, I agree, like going to the playground, it becomes like an excursion, an activity you do with, you put your kids in a car or on a bike, and you go to a destination, a new, interesting, popular playground, and you stay there, and it's fenced in, and it's pretty safe to sit there. You see parents, they mostly look at their phones, and the kids play. It's like an activity that you do in a certain allotted time. But in Sweden, this has been expanded. We have these kind of indoor playgrounds, and they are private. So you go to like in a big, like, somewhere outside in an industrial area, and there is an old warehouse, and inside you have these kind of play. It's like a huge indoor playground, and you pay, I don't know, 10 euros an hour or something, and then your kids can play for free, and you sit in a cafe and wait for them. And it's the most like sad, sorry thing in a way. I mean, kids love it. My kids tell me all the time, we want to go. Like that's their dream, and I always say no. But it's like, and it's like, but I can't bring myself to do it. But it's still a pressure to do this. So it's a kind of a way how you can capitalize on play. So play has been capitalized on in many ways, and I think historically it was something seen as, kids do it. It's kids stuff. It's not part of the adult world. It's like, why would we? I think that was in a way genius, but also problematic. In what Aldo Van Ike was that he organized these kind of in-between places where kids already played. And he just saw, there is a potential here to make this better as an architect. I can design something that is less dangerous, maybe more fun, safer, an inviting environment that is pleasant for more people than just kids. And we can use this space while we wait for it to be, turned into something else, because a lot of these playgrounds in Amsterdam that I talked about, all of the, like, there are very few of them left. If there was 1,000, I don't know, there's like a handful that are still there. Most of them have been sort of replaced by housing or shops or other buildings. But I would say like this. So play. I guess that the light in the end of the tunnel is that we have to allow that this play is something that is always has two sides. I mean, you can play the game, but you can also decide not to play the game, if you know what I mean. Like the punk movement was part of that, and it was both inside and outside, I guess. So there is always, and I think that's the attraction to some of these kind of more initiatives that comes from young architects or designers or people that feel awkward being just a part of a corporate structure. It is that I can use my skills and abilities to open up opportunities to see the world in a different ways. And I would say that, so there is always this, even though maybe I don't want to paint it out as too rosy, I see it as, it's a very disproportionate system we have, like it's highly asymmetrical. And I don't know if there will ever, like this, you know, the situation is they thought that, you know, this happening or event, it could sort of break down the barriers between the real world and the perceived sort of contained world. And on the other side there is, if we just see clearly, people would sort of become revolutionaries, all of them at once, and take over and transform society. I don't know if it makes sense to still believe in these things, but I think that if it's also in a way our responsibility and obligation to keep trying as architects or designers, and play can be powerful because it has this opportunity to also we don't have to play by the rules. Is that a light, a small flickering light?
I was checking, there are no questions from the audience, fortunately, so I was checking all the channels. This is I think like a very, very interesting topic that we could talk hours and hours about this. So from my side, I think I don't have any more comments or questions. What about you, Toby? Or
I have tons of still. We could go on. I mean, also your reflections on postmodernism. This would make a seminar of probably 2 semesters. This would be really great. But maybe we have to, like, for today. It's getting dark also in the room that you're in. Meanwhile,
yes. There is another Biennial probably where we can address these ideas of the postmodern.
I would propose to continue this conversation at some point for sure, because we're also planning in Berlin in summer, hopefully in a more friendly and open environment, Berlin Pavilion of the Biennale, because the project continues 1 year. So maybe there will be an opportunity to host you there, or we will keep discussing. And yes, I would like,
let me know. I'll come.
Yeah, that would be great. I would like to use the opportunity and thank our supporter, Georgia Close to Europe and Economic Policy Research Center, who made this talk possible and supported us. And of course, Creative Europe, which supports the whole biennial. And I would like to thank you, Tor, very much for joining us and for such a really amazing lecture that we could really continue discussing the whole day about it. And I would like to thank Tobias for letting to use his space today. And yes, hope to see you in a physical space soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's
You're good.
really nice.
Greetings from Berlin.
Take care now. Bye.
Yes. Bye, everyone. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.